The Kennebec Journal and Morning Sentinel are your source for additional facts on Question 1, local candidate profiles, and statewide results following the election. Find introductory offers online at centralmaine.com/subscribe.
I'm Judy Meyer, and I'm more than happy to welcome you all to this forum, which is hosted by the Portland Press-Herald, the Sun Journal, the Kennebec Journal, and the Morning Sentinel, to hear our panelists discuss the truth about Question 1. This event is made possible by supporters of journalism, including our local advertisers and subscribers. If you haven't already, we encourage you to subscribe to your local paper. You will find a number of links for a variety of subscription options in the chat tonight. We have had enormous response to this forum, too many to get everybody in this virtual room, so the event is being recorded and will be available on our websites. We've received dozens of questions from hundreds of participants already, and we will be taking live questions later in the evening. So if you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A, not the chat. Now, please let me introduce you to the journalists who will be joining us tonight. Craig Anderson has been with the Press-Herald for 9 years and is currently the newspaper's business editor. Andrew Rice is a Sun Journal staff writer who covers city government in Lewiston and Auburn. And Tux Turkle is a longtime staff writer for the Press-Herald and the Maine Sunday Telegram, who covers energy and utility issues. And I am going to turn the forum over to Tux to walk us through the history of the New England Clean Energy Connect project and briefly summarize the issues surrounding Question 1. Tux?
Thank you, Judy. Hello, thanks very much for tuning in on this chilly fall evening in Maine. I want to take 5 minutes or so to sum up what this project's really about, why Mainers are voting on it, and why the ballot question seems so confusing. Well, let's start with why. This all started in 2016. That's when Massachusetts enacted a landmark climate change law aimed at phasing out fossil fuels and lowering electric rates. Part of the law mandated that mass utilities sign contracts for a certain amount of wind, solar, and hydro, and 46 projects submitted proposals in early 2017, including CMP in a partnership with Hydro-Quebec. But CMP's project was only one of 3 proposals involving Hydro-Quebec. Another one would have run power lines under Lake Champlain in Vermont. If Mass had picked that Vermont project, we wouldn't be here tonight. Now, going underground is better for the environment, but it's expensive. So in 2017, Mass chose Northern Pass, which would have gone through the White Mountains of New Hampshire. If that project had been built, we wouldn't be here tonight. But New Hampshire residents overwhelmingly opposed that line, and a state siting agency killed the project in February of 2018. So that put NESEC back into play. And unlike the Vermont line, almost all the Maine project runs 145 miles above ground, 2/3 along existing corridors. That made it the next best deal for Mass ratepayers. So in June of 2018, the Mass utilities announced that they had negotiated an agreement with CMP. And that's how we got here. But what exactly is this project? Well, NESEC is a high voltage direct current transmission line with a capacity of 1,200 megawatts. That's enough energy to run roughly 1 million homes. It would carry that energy from Quebec to a converter station in Lewiston, where it would enter the New England grid. Remember, New England's climate fighting strategy revolves around electrifying the regional economy. That means getting us to drive electric cars, to warm our homes with heat pumps. So NESEC could be a big new 24/7 connection. What's more, this power would be clean hydroelectricity. Well, that's what Hydro-Quebec says, but as we'll discuss later, there's debate over whether it's really clean and will always be hydro. There's also debate over the route. The most controversial part is a 53-mile stretch between the Forks and the Quebec border. This forested area has been logged for generations, but many people feel passionate about this piece of the North Woods. Project opponents say a new power line would further fragment a forest landscape of national significance. Worth noting, the DEP is requiring the power corridor in this section to be no more than 54 feet wide. Fewer than 1,000 acres are being cleared in total for this project. NESEC secured all its state and federal permits before starting construction last winter. The company has already spent more than $350 million. But one approval's now getting a second look. In August, a Superior Court judge voided a lease across public lands after ruling that state officials failed to conduct a proper review. CMP and the state are appealing this ruling. But the Department of Environmental Protection is holding a public hearing tomorrow and whether it should suspend the permit. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court is allowing construction to continue during the appeal, except on the public lands. So amid all this uncertainty, voters will weigh in on a complicated 54-word question. I'm going to read it in case some of you are you maybe tuning in with just audio. The question reads, do you want to ban the construction of high-impact electric transmission lines in the upper Kennebec region and to require the legislature to approve all other such projects anywhere in Maine, both retroactively to 2020 and require the legislature retroactively to 2014 to approve by 2/3 vote such projects using public land? Wow, well, that's about as clear as a June morning in a Maine harbor. Well, a more simple question was challenged in court last year, and it was declared unconstitutional. So opponents drafted a new multi-part question. They gathered enough signatures early this year. But last summer, a legislator who supports the project asked the Secretary of State to break out the single multi-part question into 3 separate questions. His request was turned down in court. Meanwhile, both sides are capitalizing on the confusion. They're spending millions of dollars on sometimes deceptive advertising and messaging. That's creating an extra layer of fog. This evening, we'll do what we can to help cut through this murk. And if you haven't already, please read our deep dive into question 1, published in yesterday's Maine Sunday Telegram, as well as the Sun Journal, the Kennebec Journal, and the Morning Sentinel newspapers. Thanks again for being here.
Thanks, Tux. As I mentioned, we received an avalanche of questions. So we took everything that we got and we looked at them, and certain themes emerged. So we have selected questions that are representative of those themes, and we're going to answer as many as we can, and then we'll move to live audience questions. So this first one, Craig, if you could answer this, and this is a question that I'm reading directly from a reader. Please explain for all voters the yes means no and no means yes trickery of referendum questions. What happens if I vote yes or if I vote no?
Right. So this is one of those yes, we have no bananas type situations where you vote yes if you want no, and you vote no if you want yes on the corridor. I don't know if it's the result of trickery. I think it's just that the purpose of the referendum is to stop something rather than to make something happen. So by voting yes, you're saying you want to stop it. And by voting no, you're saying you don't want to stop it. That's really all there is to it.
Thank you. Tux, you mentioned that the question is written in 3 parts, and that has been highly confusing for a lot of people. Can you talk a little bit more about the court's ruling, why the 3 parts stayed together as one?
Yeah, let's talk about the 3-part thing, because there seems to be a lot of confusion and a lot of interest of how did this really get to this point? So I took the time to actually find the original question, which read this. The original question was, do you want to require the Maine Public Utilities Commission to reject a previously approved proposal to construct the New England Clean Energy Connect electric power line transmission line through Western Maine? Well, that question was rejected by the court because it was basically asking the agency to undo approval already given. So opponents went back and they redrafted another question. This one said, this was an act, the proposed law was an act to require legislative approval of certain transmission lines, require legislative approval of certain transmission lines and facilities and other projects on public reserved lands, and prohibit the construction of certain transmission lines in the upper Kennebec region. And that's what 80,000 people signed. And so that went to the Secretary of State, and her job was to turn that into language that accurately reflected the law, the proposed law. And that's what they came up with. And as I said before, there was an attempt to split that into 3 parts, but the Supreme Court rejected that. So that's how we got here.
And will the result of the vote be binding?
Well, what we've found with every step of the way, where everything that happens in this process is going to be litigated. So both sides have said they would go to court. So I'm not sure what binding can mean at this point. You know, nothing seems binding in this process.
Okay, so we'll find out after the vote. Okay, could we talk a little bit about this, the power line running through what's been called unspoiled wilderness? The opponents are calling it unspoiled, but you've already talked a little bit about that it is active logging property, and how many miles are being cut and how many have already been cut.
Yeah, so there was testimony pre-filed for this DEP hearing tomorrow that we'll be covering, in which NESEC said they, as of early October, had already cleared 108 miles and installed 58 poles. And they do expect to finish clearing by the end of the year. And someone asked, so how do you put that in perspective? Well, Maine has about 17.5 million acres of working forests, and about 446,000 are harvested every year, according to the USDA Forest Service inventory. And the NESEC project will clear less than 1,000. Of course, those won't grow back the way the normal forest does, but it gives you some perspective of the clearing. And the forest that we talk about, you know, everyone has a different opinion of what's wilderness, but this is not old growth forest like some people say. This is not virgin, untouched wilderness. This is land in Maine that was owned by paper companies for generations and is still being harvested. But having said that, obviously there's amazing scenery here. There's hunting and fishing and wetlands and biodiversity, and it's part of an area that's of national and maybe even global significance as far as the span of unbroken forest. But of course, it is broken by logging roads, and there are some power lines that go through there. There's hydro dams. You know, it's not untouched wilderness. So that's really the question, is like, how do you interpret wilderness and its values?
Will the power line actually bring clean, renewable energy into New England, or are opponents who allege the project is just greenwashing energy right?
Yeah,
this is a question. This is the most question most on this.
And you know, as we wrote on Sunday, it's one we can't answer with certainty, and I wish we could. But the problem is, you know, Hydro-Quebec is a provincial company in a different country, and our oversight of them is not quite the same as some people would like. And it's not, people say it's a big extension cord that just comes from a hydro dam in Canada down into Maine, but it's more complicated than that. You know, power is generated up there in these giant dams, and it goes into a network. And exactly how it's being doled out is up to Hydro-Quebec, because they have the ability to buy power from other grids in Ontario and New York and sell it or buy it. And so you don't know over the course of 20 years exactly where all that power is going to come from at any given moment. And the second issue that some people have, we've gotten a lot of requests to talk about mega dams. And by that definition, people are talking about these giant impoundments, man-made lakes that hold back rivers and create hundreds of thousands of acres of flooded forest. Now, this power is not coming from new dams that are going to be built. Hydro-Quebec says it has enough power to send it to not only Massachusetts, but also to another project in New York. So is it clean? Is it renewable? Well, it depends whether you take it on faith and what Hydro-Quebec says, and also depends on whether you think mega dams are clean, and it's versus what? Like, is it compared to what? A coal plant, a natural gas plant? So these are value judgments all around.
So much has been made of the fact that some environmental groups have come out in favor of the project and some strongly opposing. Can you just talk a little bit where that split is?
Yeah, and that's part of what we were just talking about. There's some groups like Conservation Law Foundation, Acadia Center. They have taken the approach that climate change is an emergency. It's an all hands on deck, all the above situation. They negotiated certain benefits, and they came away with the idea that on balance, this is worth it. It's not a perfect thing for the reasons we're talking about, but compared to other things during the fight on climate change, it's worth doing. But other groups like the Natural Resources Council, Sierra Club, they came up with an opposite approach. They had studies have been done that said, on balance, we don't really know that this is going to be clean energy for the reason we talked about as far as how Hydro-Quebec can manage its resources. And when you put that together with the fragmenting of the forest, they felt it wasn't worth it. So it's one of those situations where the environmental community is split. And I think that's partially caused some of the confusion for people when they see groups that they respect or members of taking different stance on this issue.
So the big question is who's funding this project and how much has been spent. And the answer is a lot. I think the Press Herald has just updated that story from the campaign finance projects. And Strawberry, I believe we have a slide showing the expenditures so far. And I think, Craig, you were going to take this.
Yeah. So as of the most recent campaign finance reports, the total spending is about 60. It's over 60 million, and that's basically being spent by three different groups. There's two groups on the supporter side that have spent quite a bit of money, and then there's one group on the no side. So and when I say yes and no, I'm talking about the corridor itself. So Hydro-Quebec, they have a political action committee called Hydro-Quebec Maine Partnership that obviously supports the corridor and therefore is for a no vote on the referendum. They've spent about $15 million on this campaign. And then you also have Clean Energy Matters, which also is against the referendum and for the corridor. And then on the other side, you have Mainers for Local Power, which is supported by some of the environmental groups and also some out-of-state utility interests, and they've spent about a little under 13 million. So overall, the spending's over 60 million. Most of it is on the no on question one side, but the amount on the pro side has been substantial also. And one thing that I think Tux did a good job of pointing out in his story is that we've kind of all, as voters here, been caught up in a battle between some utility companies with competing interests that don't necessarily have much to do with the disruption to Maine wilderness or any of those things. It all kind of comes down to competing interests for power in New England. Next Era is a company that owns utility interests, including a nuclear power plant in New Hampshire. They have concerns that the NESEC project would bring in lower rates and would undercut their rates. So it's not just about things happening in Maine. It's certainly, the fact that so much money has been poured into this campaign, I think really shows you that the interest in this goes beyond our state borders, certainly.
So we did have a live question on this topic asking, when CMP spends money on, in support of the project, is it ratepayers who are actually spending that money, or is it coming from a separate pot? How does that work?
No, this is not ratepayer money. This is money from investors. I mean, first of all, we got to remember, we talk about it as a CMP project, but really it's an Avangrid project, and Avangrid is the domestic parent of CMP. CMP is part of their network division. This project is really being paid for, by Massachusetts ratepayers, but as far as the investment is concerned, it's coming out of the investors of Avangrid, which is a publicly traded company.
Okay. We are getting some live questions. So we had a lot of questions in advance about the retroactivity claim here. Are the concerns about retroactive laws real? Or are they being used as a smokescreen to turn voters away from the facts of the corridor project?
So I don't know that I can answer that question in the way it was worded, but what I can tell you is that retroactivity is not, it would not be unheard of or unprecedented in any way to pass a law that has a retroactive element to it. The Maine Supreme Judicial Court has upheld laws in the past that have retroactivity clauses in them. I can't really give you a good recent example of a state law that was passed with a retroactive clause, but we had a good a letter to the editor that we ran recently from a lawyer in Portland, John Westhoff, who was involved in this effort in the 80s to protect the Portland waterfront from non-marine related interests. And that resulted in a referendum that passed in Portland that had a retroactivity clause. And it went to the Supreme Court in Maine, and they supported it and said that the Maine Constitution allows for retroactive laws, whether it be at the state level or the municipal level. So it's certainly something that's allowed and is legal and constitutional. Whether or not you like the idea of a law going back and undoing things that might already be in the works, I think that's more of a personal decision. But I will say that as far as we know, there are no other projects that would be affected by this retroactivity clause other than the NESEC project.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, there's a lot going on in Lewiston around this project, and it appears to be the city that will benefit most financially from the project. Can you talk a little bit about how many jobs will be created and what the increase in tax revenue for the converter station will be, the station that's already under construction, and where that is? Just sort of lay that out for us, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, you're right that, Lewiston sort of, I think from the very beginning, sort of been seen as a sort of stronghold of support for the project, and that's been tied to the tax revenue that they would projected to see, which it's sort of fluctuated since the beginning between 6 and 8 million annually. But I talked to the city assessor last week, and he said it's going to be about 7 to 7.5 million annually in tax revenue. And that's all tied to the converter station, which is construction's already underway. So far, the city has already seen about 1.5 million in tax revenue, and is supposed, which is about half of what they're going to see in the total year this year, and that's just tied to the work that's happened so far. And that converter station is on a section of land. It's about 6.5 acres. It's between a piece of Main Street and Merrill Road, which is sort of existing corridor that they're going to widen by about 75 feet. And it's going to tie into a nearby substation on Larrabee Road. But all of the converter station and the line that was approved by the planning board back in the beginning of this year, January. So yeah. In terms of jobs, I was told today that there's 43 people working out at the converter station site as of now.
And will there be continuous jobs once the converter site, the station opens?
There will be some, but I wasn't told a figure.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there's, ongoing employees at that site, but in terms of a number, I don't know yet.
Is
Yeah,
this
they
gonna,
haven't.
I was
Oh,
just going to say,
Good old lag. Go ahead, Judy.
Yeah, are we going to be able to see this from the street, Andrew? Or because I know we ran an aerial photo over the weekend, and it looks like it's tucked into the woods a little bit.
Yeah, no, you won't be able to see it from the street. Yeah, we did run those good aerials, but no, there's a tree line buffer, and yeah, you won't be able to see it.
Okay. Go ahead, Craig.
I was just going to add that most of the marketing or promotion that Avangrid has done, or that Hydro-Quebec has done about the project, when it comes to talking about jobs, they really emphasize jobs that would be, the people that would be employed during the construction phase, but they don't really talk about after that. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. Well, since you're on deck, Craig, what direct benefit will Maine ratepayers receive in terms of increased electric supplies or lower electricity rates if the project is allowed to continue?
Sure. So as Tux mentioned earlier, there were some environmental groups that collaborated with the state, with the Maine Office of Public Advocate, the Governor's Energy Office, in 2019, and they extracted some concessions from the NESEC folks, including, money for high efficiency heat pumps, electric vehicle charging stations, energy efficiency programs for low income residents. So not, obviously not direct cash to Mainers, but these different programs are valued at a total of $260 million. And in addition to that, Governor Mills had come out and said that she received a commitment from Hydro-Quebec that they would sell enough discounted energy to Maine every year to run 70,000 homes, and that was after the deal was criticized for the fact that none of the energy was actually going to go to Maine. So that's a non-trivial amount of discounted energy, but it's certainly not enough to lower energy rates. It's not going to move the needle either way, up or down in Maine, as far as what people pay for their electricity.
Right. Well, the other thing to add to that, because I know that's something people always want to know, is like, how is this going to lower my electric bill? This is a project that runs for 20 years, for one thing, and we're talking about what happens in the future, not what's going to happen to your bill today. Like we wrote the other day that we have a pretty good sense that electric rates are going to be going up in Maine next year because of the natural gas crunch and the wholesale rates. So you have to project out in the future, what's electricity going to cost in the years ahead, and how will this affect it? And boy, that's a tough calculation, it's not going to be much. You know, it's not something you're going to probably notice in your bill. But here's something worth remembering. They would not be, NextEra and Calpine and Vistra, they would not be spending millions of dollars here if it wasn't going to affect electric rates. It's going to lower wholesale electric rates in New England. Otherwise, they wouldn't be putting all that money into it. But how it affects you and me at home, that's really a tough one to quantify, even though some people have done it and they say, well, it's going to be like a nickel or 10 cents or whatever. Whatever it is, bottom line is the project isn't really being built for us. Like, so we get something out of it, maybe, but it's not being built to lower electric rates in Maine.
Right.
So, Craig, you mentioned the deal, the $260 million deal. Have there been any details other than just the generalized low-income families would benefit? Are there any specific short or long-term benefits that Maine would realize from this project that have emerged since the deal was struck?
Well, you know, certainly they've talked about in the short term jobs. You know, the NESEC folks have said that, you know, that the construction phase of the project would create something, you know, over 1,600 jobs a year. And they, you know, they don't talk about jobs beyond the construction phase. So, you know, you can make your own assumptions about what that means. They also say that it would increase Maine's GDP. You know, there are property value increases involved, other revenue increases, and they value it at $573 million. I haven't seen a real specific breakdown of that, although it may exist. But as Tuck said, you know, the project isn't for us. It's like if somebody wanted to build a train track through Maine for a train that, you know, doesn't stop in Maine, it stops in Canada and Massachusetts. So, you know, we're just sort of you know, the passing through area of this thing.
Andrew, when the city council talked about the first tax revenue payment last week and the fact that they were able to manage the budget and lower taxes, is there any specific benefit in the budget for low-income individuals living in Lewiston, or is it more of a generalized reduction in the budget for everybody?
Yeah, I mean, really what they announced was that the added valuation from the work that's been done so far on a converter station helped the city lower the tax rate. So they lowered the property tax rate by, I think it was about $1.41. And, you know, at the time for Lewiston, which is definitely on the higher end of the property tax rates for, you know, similar municipalities, I think that was, you know, seen as a big deal. But in terms of its impact on low income, you know, people, I do think that's just ultimately going to be decided by how the city council chooses to prioritize the revenue. I mean, so far they've talked about, you know, they could further lower the property tax rate or, you know, reinstate programs that have been lost for years, that, you know, dating back to the recession. But I think, you know, it could be, you know, a combination of tax relief or new programs, you know, focused on the schools. I mean, Lewiston's, you know, got a lot of poverty. They've got the Choice Neighborhoods initiative that they're in the middle of right now. But you know, all the elected officials I've talked to so far, you know, that's what they're telling me, is it's, you know, they're thinking about it as it could be a combination of those things. But we also have, you know, an election in a couple of weeks, and those people might be out and new people might be in. So I guess you never know.
And the revenue received so far is just basically on the land along the corridor in the beginning of the building of the project. So will that increase once the converter station is completed?
Yeah, that's what I've been told is basically the $3 million tax bill for this year is just on, it's for the work that's been done so far, and that it will gradually go up to the 7 million figure that I was told, once the line is operational, basically. I did see a section of that question that asked sort of about the harm for taxpayers, and it made me think, the only thing I could really think of was just, if for some reason Lewiston decides to build all that revenue into its budgets, and then, all of a sudden the project is killed or unsuccessful, then sort of they're sort of back to square one. But what that would look like, I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. So we've had a number of people ask tonight and earlier in the week, why isn't this project going through Vermont or New Hampshire? Tux, you talked a little bit about it in your introduction, but Craig, would you mind going into a little bit more what the processes were there and why they were rejected?
Yeah, and Tux, certainly feel free to chime in on this, but my understanding, at least, is that there were these three options that were proposed: one through New Hampshire, one through Maine, one through Vermont. New Hampshire was first choice. New Hampshire voters rejected that proposal, and Maine was second choice. And now we're doing it in Maine. Presumably, if Mainers vote no, then maybe it'll go to Vermont next. I don't know.
Well, I mean, the thing was the Vermont project was TDI New England was the developer. That project, as I understand it, had its permits, but as I said in the beginning, it's so much more expensive to go underground. And in the end, the Massachusetts utilities they have some obligation to the ratepayers too, right? I mean, if we were negotiating in Maine, you'd want the best rates you could get. So it's not unusual that they picked a cheaper project. But a lot of people have said, look, if you want to do this, why don't you spend the money and do it right? But that's not what happened, at least in the first pass, because they picked Northern Pass and that did not work out. And now they're certainly struggling here. So, should they have gone to Vermont in the first place? I don't know. But that, I think with all these things, Craig, we talk about this over the years. It's very hard to cite any large scale energy project. I mean, no one's going to be happy all the time. It just doesn't work out. There's always impacts. We were talking about it. People talk about solar and onshore wind or offshore wind. All those things have impacts. We've covered the impacts on onshore wind for years until they ran out of transmission capacity to build too many more. Mm-hmm. We've been covering offshore wind very heavily, and we know the fishing community is not happy about that. There's people who think solar there's too much in Augusta already. They didn't like the siting it, don't want to look at it. So there's no clean answer to any of this stuff, but we'll see where this one comes out, because there have been attempts for years to get another line into New England from Quebec. And there's 3 states in northern New England that border it. And those are your choices right now. So we're seeing what happens.
So we already talked about the fact that this will be litigated on either side, no matter what the outcome here. But does Massachusetts have another ready option, or is this the last stop?
Well, I mean, you could go back to Vermont, right? I mean, it's still possible. You got to remember too, they've signed contracts with Avangrid, and those contracts have already been delayed and pushed forward. At some point, there's some language that says something about, this doesn't go on forever, but I don't know what that point is. In New Hampshire, it got to a point where a siting agency, we don't have that here, but there was an energy siting agency here that said no, and it went to court and it died. And in that case, the Eversource, the developer, Massachusetts developer utility, their investors ate a big charge off because of that. That could happen here, but we haven't got that point yet. And this referendum will be one step of that process.
Can we talk a little bit more about the climate impact here? We're getting that question a lot tonight. You know, a yes or a no, there's impact either way. So could we dissect that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this goes in the category of the uncertainty, just like the clean energy. There have been some studies done about, you know, like how many cars it would take off the road and things like that, the equivalent. And those are figures that the NESAC has gone with. But all this is predicated on the idea that it's all hydro all the time. So if it's not, then it's different. Obviously, the Conservation Law Foundation, Governor Mills, who certainly is very passionate about climate change, she made the calculation that this is a net positive for climate change. But Natural Resources Council came up with the opposite for the reasons we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have all those figures in front of me, but I can just say in a general sense, it's debatable, the impact on the climate.
You know, another issue that I've heard people bring up has more to do with just sort of a perception of Maine being amenable to clean energy projects. You know, the argument goes like, if we make everybody jump through a bunch of hoops that, you know, that are onerous, and we don't give them any certainty for planning purposes about whether their project's going to go through or not, then it could dissuade some clean energy companies potentially in the future from coming to Maine.
Well, this has already happened, Craig, and now
Right.
It's not a perfect analogy because Statoil did not have all its permits, but many people remember there was a Norwegian energy company that wanted to do a pilot offshore wind farm in Maine, and it was embraced during the administration of John Baldacci, but when Governor Page came into office, he was really against it. And some of the things he did basically made that company say, you know what, we can't do business in Maine. They actually built that wind farm in Scotland. So now we have a situation, we have a governor who's very supportive of this stuff. But the problem with all these projects, they tend to take more than 2 to 4 years. Like governments tend to turn over before they're done. So that's definitely something that people talk about, is like, can Maine make a commitment to something and keep it through the administrations that invariably turn over?
Well, that's been a really interesting reflection on this project, is that Governor LePage also supported the project, and we have Governor Mills supporting it, and they didn't agree on much. So
that's right.
To have them
Yeah,
both
they can agree on that.
is interesting. Yeah. Andrew, was the climate change question discussed in Lewiston, or was it really more about the revenue and the jobs?
Yeah, it's been mostly focused on the tax revenue for Lewiston, because one of the questions we've asked our candidates this year in our profiles that we've been running is whether or not they support the project, and I think a lot of them are saying, even though I might have my reservations about the project, I'm just as a Lewiston official, I would vote for the best interest of residents, and they're mostly saying they would support it just because of the tax revenue. But in terms of the sort of impacts on climate change, I haven't heard much, but I think it's mostly just been on what it can do for a town that's still trying to pull its way out of a recession.
Mm-hmm. If the project does fail, is there any would there be any direction to replant the trees, restore the cut, or would that be all part of whatever future litigation we might be looking at?
So in the testimony that was filed for the DEP hearing, the first time that I've seen anyway, there was a reference to decommissioning plan. First of all, in Maine, there's very little tree planting being done. Basically, trees grow everywhere in Maine. Like if you cut something down and come back in 10 years, you're going to have a little forest starting. So there's no plan to replant, but natural regeneration would do that. But they did talk in that about if they got to a point where they canceled the project, they would have a decommissioning plan that would take the towers down, take the foundations down, basically restore the site so that a young forest could emerge in that clear cut.
And we heard from a reader who, appreciates that the electrical grid needs to be upgraded and that the power needs to move through Maine into Massachusetts, but wonders if CMP has any plans to upgrade our grid in Maine and improve our power lines. Will there be any upgrade projects in Maine in the next 5 to 10 years? Has that been discussed?
Not as part of this.
Yeah.
Not as part of this project?
There's a whole bunch of stuff happening at the PUC that's ongoing about upgrading the distribution system in Maine, and that's what we're talking about. The lines that go down in storms and the blackouts we had in these big storms. But there's a tension with that because it costs money. And at least under the current ownership structure, there's a give and take at the PUC of how much insulated wire to put up, how many stronger poles. Most of it's cutting down the tree branches because almost the vast majority of the local outages are from trees falling on power lines. And so that's an ongoing debate at the PUC, how much money to spend on that, because that is paid for by ratepayers. So you could say, well, we can cut down all the trees within 100 feet of every power line in Maine, which people don't want, and it would be very expensive. So that's the give and take on that.
Well, we've sort of morphed into our live questions without, I didn't explain that, but we've moved on to questions live. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A, not in the chat, and we'll try to answer as many of these as we can. One reader wants to know how the vote can happen after the project was approved and the work started. So you've already sort of worked through this timeline, but why haven't the court shut it all down until the vote happens?
Well, I think I understand the question. So the project was started before any of this referendum stuff was even a thing, right? So there have been now multiple efforts to stop it while it's been in progress, and this is the latest one. But there's nothing in the law that says you need voters to approve your power line project. So there wouldn't have been any reason for the state to prevent them from stopping. I mean, the things that they were required to get to start this project were permits from different regulatory bodies, and they got all those. And then all this stuff came after. So they were just kind of going along, doing the normal thing that you would do to build a project like this. And then these campaigns got started.
And there wasn't attempts to, in this public land dispute that we'll be covering tomorrow, the Natural Resources Council, I think, asked the court to basically, until this issue is solved, stop work on everything. But that was not approved.
Right.
So work is continuing, and we're seeing it in Lewiston with the very visible converter station, except for the mile that's in dispute.
Right.
Otherwise, the project is moving.
Yes. That the company is taking that risk. Investors are taking that risk.
Mm-hmm.
But again, they're doing it because you have these contracts in Massachusetts that have a date to them. You can't just say, well, we'll get back to this next year sometime or 2 years from now. Also, remember, they have all these crews, some from out of state, all this equipment. You're here doing it. So it's very expensive to shut it all down. and they don't want to do that. So and also you have weather here. You have regulations about when you can work in certain areas because of environmental reasons. So they're working while they can.
Is anybody hearing any conversation that maybe the $260 million deal was an undersell and that maybe the state should go back to CMP and Avangrid and renegotiate that, or are we past that point?
Well, certainly there are people on there are people who are opposed to the corridor who are saying that Maine should have got a better deal. But then there are people who are for the corridor that say, well, Maine got a deal, which why would they even get one? Because we're not paying for this. The environmental impact is, I mean, if you just look at it in terms of numbers, this project would clear about 1,000 acres of forest in total. That's out of what I think it's like 27 million acres or 17, I think it's 17.6 million acres. So that's like 0.006% of the forest land in Maine. So from that perspective, someone might say, well, why would we get anything? But we got what we got, and
Judy, to that point though, you're saying, we've negotiated something, we signed an agreement, should we now say, you know what, we don't like what we signed, let's go back and renegotiate it? Because this was called a stipulated agreement of the PUC. It was negotiated by a bunch of parties, including the governor's energy office, the industrial users, and the environmental groups that I just mentioned, public advocate. They all came up with that agreement because in the very beginning, to be honest, at least my thought, when you look at the very beginning of the project, CMP really didn't offer very much at all to Maine. There was, and they wanted to go over the Kennebec River with the power lines. They, through time, negotiated a lot of stuff that Craig mentioned, plus the line under the river, all the DEP, narrowing of the corridor. They wanted to cut a corridor 150 feet.
That's right.
Down to 54. So we got stuff, but if you're opposing them, there's never enough. And the only thing I would say though, they've been able to spend tens of millions of dollars on advertising. A lot of people say, gee, I wish we'd gone back and gotten some of that money, but that's water over the dam, so to speak.
We've had a number of people post in the Q&A the question, just the observation that doesn't cleaner air and a more stable climate benefit Mainers. It's not something we can really put a dollar on, but is there a benefit to the project in the long term in terms of our the wider environment of New England?
If you accept that the energy is all coming from hydroelectric power, then yeah, I think you could make that argument because hydroelectric power is cleaner than other types of power. But again, that's in dispute. Some people don't trust that it's all going to be hydropower.
We have someone asking if anybody has really done any conflict of interest work on the funders of the question on both sides.
I don't know that. I mean, they clearly have interests. I don't think anybody's hiding that they have an interest. These utility companies. I certainly think. I mean, this one thing I think you guys will probably agree on is, the fact that so much money has been poured into these campaigns, and there's been so many ads, and people that make ads, they get creative and they try to come up with ways to influence people and persuade people, and they're like, well, let's try this argument, and I think that's part of the reason why this is so confusing now for people, because so many ads have come out trying so many different angles on this thing that I think we've gotten pretty far away from what this is really about. This is about a company that owns a nuclear power plant and a company that owns a hydropower plant competing with each other and having competing interests. And we're fighting the proxy war for them.
And the war over the truth.
I mean, there's some truth in there, but I just think there's also a lot of a lot of like dangling of arguments to see if they'll stick. And I just think some of them haven't really been that helpful in helping people understand what this is really about.
We have a couple of more environmental questions about the fire danger that this line may create. We see the fires in California all summer long. There's been 1,500 so far. Is this project putting Maine forests at risk?
Boy, I've seen people selling an argument, but first of all, you can't make a connection between the kind of forest we have in Maine and what's going on in California. I mean, the climate is totally different and the forest is totally different. And that's a concern people have, but there's transmission lines running all through Maine and occasionally things happen, but I think it's one of those grasping at straw issues. I really do. I just don't see that that's a major concern in Maine.
Okay. Along a similar environmental line, if the mile line in question, if that were put underground instead of overhead and didn't need the poles and all of that, would that be a more sustainable option for the environment?
That would be up to the Bureau of Public Lands, who's supposed to make a determination of whether it substantially changes the public lands. Someone else mentioned that. I've heard that mentioned. I don't know if that's an option or not. So far, has not been mentioned by the company. They have talked about rerouting the project. And in their testimony, they've talked about a couple of different routes. They say the routes will be longer, that they would have more impact overall than what they were planning to do on that 9/10 of a mile. But obviously, going underground is probably preferable almost anywhere. That's the whole debate about Vermont versus the New Hampshire and Maine proposals. But whether it would make a difference on that piece of public land, first of all, is not Baxter State Park. It's a couple lots that are sustainably harvested now for timber. It's not a protected area per se.
And the corridor that's open to the public now for recreation and hunting and four-wheeling and all that would remain open. They're not shutting off public access once the corridor is constructed, correct?
There's no, unless you put up fences on both sides, I don't think you could cut off public access to any transmission corridor. I mean, you can walk right underneath them.
Okay, we have received a lot of questions, but again, they're themed, and I think we've gone over most of our topics here. But if anybody has a last-minute question here, pop right in. Or Craig, is there something we haven't discussed?
I see a question that I think is kind of interesting from Chris saying, will question 1 require the legislature's approval of any future electric transmission projects? How would that differ from the current approval process? And that gives me an opportunity to ask Tux, because I was curious to know your thoughts on this. So that part of the question that says, I mean, there's a couple things in there that it doesn't just say the NESEC project. It says a high impact transmission project. So the first part of the question says, we would ban high impact transmission projects in the upper Kennebec Valley region. So am I wrong in assuming that if some other project many years from now by a different company was proposed in that area, that it would also be banned and would not be allowed to be built?
In that area?
In that area, yeah.
The question is also talking about that definition of transmission line anywhere in Maine would need legislative approval. Because there's 50 miles in length, outside of a statutory corridor, not generator interconnection, and not for electric reliability. And so, some people have, someone actually emailed me today to talk about a project. The so-called MEPCO line is getting a rebuild part of it up in, I think Penobscot County maybe. And someone was saying, well, it could affect that. But, you know, I'm not sure, because I'm not sure if that's reliability or something else. I've heard different things on that. So
Yeah, it's interesting.
that's certainly debatable.
But I think that it would be fair to say in answer to the viewer's question that, you know, if a similar project came along and the referendum passed, it would require legislative approval also, right? It wouldn't just be for this project.
That's what they're saying, if it meets those definitions.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Okay, thank you, Craig and Andrew and Tux, for your expertise and explanations on this. We will continue reporting on this right up until Election Day, and clearly far beyond that. I really encourage people to look at the piece in Sunday's papers. It answers a lot of the very similar questions we talked about tonight, and there's a really good explanation about this mile in dispute and answers a lot of questions about that. Just as a last reminder, this event was made possible by supporters of local journalism. If you haven't already, we encourage you to support our mission with a subscription or by gifting a subscription to your local paper. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And again, this recording will be available on our websites for those of you who are not able to sign in. And thank you very much for joining us.